Hi there, and welcome to Meryl. My name is Meryl, and I like to do deep dives into the latest research on neurodiversity.
And I'm Alistair. I'm a psychotherapist, and I love creating the metaphors and stories that help make sense of it all.
And together, we're exploring how neurodiversity shapes our lives. Let's get started.
This episode of Merrill is brought to you by my Copilot AI for when your willpower won't. You know, those 2 a.m. moments when you're supposed to be going to sleep, but you can't stop doom scrolling. Or when you're stuck on the sofa with your phone after work. Well, my Copilot AI is your personal AI co-pilot that can help you get on with the things that you really want and need to do exactly in those moments. Whether that's doing the laundry, getting on with your projects or hobbies, or just actually going to bed, my Copilot AI can help you with all of this. Check it out at https://mycopilot.ai. That's mycopilot.ai for when your willpower won't.
Just a note to say that we're explorers and storytellers. This podcast is not intended as therapy, advice, recommendation, or medical authority. We are just like you, inviting you along on our journey of trying to make a little sense out of fascinating research on neuroscience and neurodiversity as best as we can.
Speaking of learning things.
Yeah, so you just scanned the document that I sent you.
I found it so dense. It took me a while to work
Yes.
out what it was talking about.
That's why I sent it to you. Like I was just calmly doing research and then found this one and I was like, what is happening?
Yeah, I'm afraid I ended up pulling
Everything.
through the AI to like get a summary and go like, oh.
Could you see my annotations?
Yeah.
Okay.
They
yeah,
were just as dense as everything else, so I wasn't sure what was going on there either. I was like, I have no idea. So what did you take from it in the end?
I found it pretty confusing that like in ADHD medications, there's dopamine and there's norepinephrine, and dopamine makes a lot of sense to all of us, but well, at least I don't know, and I think many people don't really know what norepinephrine does. It seems to be very like other things like dopamine and like serotonin and oxytocin. It's doing multiple things in the body, so there's not a super specific answer, but it seems to be mainly connected to like the fight or flight response. It's involved in higher alertness and concentration, which makes sense why it's included in ADHD medications, right? So it makes you more alert, it makes you more concentrated on the thing that you're focused on, and it's connected to this fight or flight response, but also in they call it memory formation under stress. So basically the storage of traumatic experiences and linking certain cues, certain sensory cues. That's also what the article is about that I sent you. Linking sensory cues. In this case, it was a sound, linking that to physical pain in the case of that experiment.
So colloquially, it's like someone with, should we say, strong norepinephrine impact would be really paying attention to noticing and remembering all the bad shit that happened to them, and they would
and not even necessarily remembering, but rather like a Pavlovian reaction.
Yeah, in the body.
Yes, in the body, just really associating some sensory cue to pain. And in this case, they measured, so that the experiment in this paper was on mice. And in this case, they observed freezing behavior in the mice as a symptom of a fight or flight response, as their traumatic response to the sound. And they observed a very strong correlation between. So they made the mice associate the sound with the pain. So they got a tiny shock in their feet at the same time the sound was played. And after that, they had this fight or flight response to the sound alone. Just a kind of classical Pavlovian experiment, I would say. Is it possible? Can I share my screen in this thing? Wait, I'm going to try this. Okay, amazing. So apparently, norepinephrine is generated here in the. How would you pronounce this?
Locus Coeruleus.
Coeruleus, fantastic. So the norepinephrine is produced here, and then it is transported to everywhere. And what we're looking at is this connection. So between where it is produced and the cerebellum.
So it's produced right in the cerebellum, and this article was looking at the connection like directly into the cerebellum, that connection.
Yeah, to the norepinephrine that is transported into the cerebellum. And so they did these experiments with the mice, and they also found that if they block this entrance, basically. So if they don't let the produced norepinephrine into the cerebellum at the generation of this traumatic experience, that they will not have this fight or flight response, so that they will not make this connection between the sound and the pain.
So colloquially, we have a story that dopamine is like the reward thing that makes us remember the good stuff. And norepinephrine sort of, if we massively oversimplify it, ends up being kind of the thing that makes us remember the bad stuff. Dopamine is like, hey, I have this story about a dog that found a hamburger in a bush once, like a discarded hamburger.
And now it likes bushes very much.
And now it always goes back to that bush just in case. And of course, it's not a hamburger producing machine, but once it happened, and that dog will now forever check that spot just in case someone else has discarded a hamburger there.
Exactly. And if the dog would have had pain,
a slap, an electric shock, a step on a thorn, anything like that,
then its norepinephrine would have been produced, and it would have thought that it should avoid the bush.
So what I find really interesting about this in terms of like the lived experience for people is I often talk about how especially those of us with neurodiversity, we often live in like a permanent fight-flight response, often functional freeze. So talking about things like regulation and how to survive and live, a lot of it is about getting our bodies out of a functional freeze state or a functional fight state where we're always either collapsing or too hyper. And that's because I think we're always in a fight or flight response. So if our norepinephrine is over, which I think you were saying last time is common if you've got autism.
Yes. I think so. That there's a paper that is suggesting this. It's not for sure yet, I think.
Okay, so there might be a correlation there.
Yes.
And that would suggest that it's not unreasonable. That kind of explains why autistic people are a little bit sensitive to bad stuff and why we overreact a bit, because actually the norepinephrine makes us see events as potentially like seeing the bad of an event. Because if you've got dopamine and norepinephrine happening in the same conversation, a conversation isn't as obvious as electric shock. The conversation is sort of maybe both good and bad and a threat and lovely at the same time. So what do you respond to? Do you respond to the happy stuff in the conversation, or do you respond to the threat triggers in the conversation? The possibility that the person meant something bad. And if your norepinephrine's high, that kind of suggests that you're quite likely to, low-key, chronically see the threats in things, which keeps you just on high alert all the time.
We also remembering, like, if a very tiny bad thing happened, like someone made a comment that you felt insecure about, then
that sticks.
It's very likely that you will remember that conversation as being very bad and shameful and very uncomfortable, because that one thing happened that made your norepinephrine peak.
Right. And because it's cerebellar, right? So much of what I'm excited by in the kind of sort of last 10 years of research is just how powerful and impactful the cerebellum is. We didn't used to think it was relevant at all. Like neuroscience just ignored it for loads, going, yeah, it just does body motion. Like, yeah, not interesting, not high level. And now we're finding that it's involved in almost everything, including like the emotional stuff. And it encodes, its job is to make everything simpler. Or automate it, right? So it takes in complex signals from the rest of the brain and smooths them down into a simplified output that is kind of like the conclusion. If that process is wired or massively influenced by norepinephrine to be like, hey, I smooth down, I automate into the negative, I'm always seeing the bad stuff, that's something that you're not going to be able to think out of. Like as a psychological experience, that's happening automatically and immediately, right? So your body has encoded that. But the lived experience, how we feel about it, psychology, we're going to tell ourselves stories to make sense of that. Why do we always react to that person? Why do we always withdraw? And then we start telling ourselves all sorts of shame stories about why we're bad because this bad stuff keeps happening to us, for example. So that lived experience becomes infused with constant negativity, which makes us downers and depression if we're not balanced with like the positive. And especially if you've got the ADHD angle where your dopamine is dysregulated, don't have the balance, and you can stand up strongly in the norepinephrine. But that's interesting then, because ADHD is like like many ADHDs are kind of like pure ADHDs, sort of non-autistic ADHDs. Not really pure ADHDs, but like,
Let's call it
singularly
that for now.
that would imply, like maybe the ADHDs that we know that are kind of like bouncy and always jumping around and not actually, not the depressive ADHDs, but the sort of bouncy hyperactive ones. I mean, I'm doing massive hand waves. I'm basically wondering and curious about the experience then for ADHDers who have lower norepinephrine and dopamine dysregulation. Like, where do they end up then? Because if the norepinephrine's doing your flight, maybe this is why they don't learn. Like, classically, ADHD makes it really difficult to think about long-term consequences because you just don't learn from the current thing that went wrong so that you change your behavior next time.
Isn't that the difference between ADHD and ADD?
Say more.
Wait, do you know AD?
Yeah, I mean, I think some people use them completely interchangeably and some people use them very specifically.
Couldn't it be the case that ADHD would be like the hyperactive, low dopamine, low norepinephrine, all over the place, and that like ADD, where you don't have this hyperactive, all over the place kind of behavior, would be the higher norepinephrine variant, where you are not just bouncing around, basically.
Yeah, because it's hard to bounce around when there's too many threats, I'd imagine. You're more likely to trigger into like some sort of freeze, cautious, like not consciously, but at a body level, your body's more likely to just go like, hold on, just in case, let's withdraw, let's pull back.
Be cautious a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, this is all a bit of speculation, but I mean, that's what we're doing, isn't it? Trying to storify, make sense of what it's like as a lived experience out of this research.
I think I saw some things where people also looked into curing traumas using this connection. Like if you know that they're stored and retrieved via this Locus Coeruleus cerebellum connection in the form of norepinephrine, can't you use this information to, instead of, what is it called, the clicking
EMDR?
thingy, EMDR, like instead of doing that, working with the way that it is stored and retrieved?
I mean, how do we know that the EMDR isn't doing that?
Fair enough. Probably it is.
I think
like it is working on the automations. That's true.
And is the cerebellum hemispherical? I feel really dumb for asking that question, but I've never thought about it before.
What do you mean by that?
So our neocortex is hemispherical, right? So we've got a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere.
Yes, it is. I think
one of the,
at least the Fermis is hemispherical.
Yeah,
that's part of the cerebellum.
Yeah, so the thalamus and all that stuff isn't, but the limbic system is, and the neocortex is massively. So one of the explanations that I've kind of subscribed to around EMDR is this notion that a trauma tends to be hemispherically located. So it's like either in your left or your right. And I think one of them is more dominant. I can't remember which one. I want to say left, but I could be wrong. But apparently one hemisphere tends to hold the trauma more. So what you can do with EMDR, why it works potentially, is that you kind of bring your awareness up to that point. So you're activating the brain network in a way that starts moving towards the activation of the trauma place, like literally the neurons that encode it, or the neural activation state that encodes it. But because the other half of the brain isn't traumatized, when you come up to it, your brain backs off or wants to react and trigger to the trauma and go, whoa, we don't go down there. We need to create a different activation state to avoid this red alert firing that happens when this event is perceived. So, like someone speaks to you in a certain tone of voice and boom, that triggers those traumatized neuron activations to go, whoa, we need to react with a trigger and look after ourselves. Presumably using the cerebellum, because somewhere in the cerebellum is the shortcut that goes, hey, this red flag event, we need to react by punching or running away. So the cerebellum is going to shortcut that to keep us safe really fast. But what happens in EMDR, at least in this description, is that by using the other half of the brain every half second or second, you bounce backwards and forwards, left and right, you actually sort of stop activating or pushing against the traumatized bit because the brain doesn't want to. It's high energy. It's a lot of effort. It's like, too much. So you kind of step up to it, but you step back, you put pressure on it, and then you relieve it by moving attention to the other hemisphere, which is not blocked, not traumatized. So it continues every time it gets the stimulus to evolve its response. So it moves forward through your natural evolving activation state. Basically your experience continues. So let's say the trauma is in the left brain and the right brain isn't holding this traumatic event. So the right brain then continues to move along with that memory or that stimulus or that thought without getting stuck. And eventually the difference is such that the right brain, in this example, has moved on far enough to activate back across to the left brain, like a new activation state that is kind of beyond the trauma point, like not literally physically, but in like the activation state evolution. So
because it kind of allows the left brain, in this example, to experience it in a different way with help of the untraumatized
I think
half.
in this description, the left brain's still stuck at the trauma point and can't move forwards because the trauma is like a bail, like get out of here response. So the left brain can't move on. It has to go to a trauma trigger.
The right part does.
But the right one does. And eventually, because the right brain goes past kind of where the trauma trigger would have stopped, the left brain then gets some feedback from that, from the right brain, and goes, oh, there's a state that I could exist in that's on the other side of this trauma trigger. And then because of the way that neurons work with like back propagation and stuff, like the way that basically, the neurons like send signals back, and depending on what happened before, they wire together. So when something fires, it wires to the thing that fired beforehand. That gives the brain an opportunity to hold and the left brain now, in this example, two activation states that it's trying to flux between. One of them is the pre-trauma one that it can't let go of, and the other one is the post-trauma possibility that has been inspired by the right brain. And the left brain is going to try and wire those together in a low energy way to make sense of the activations and go, listen, I need a shortcut route around to try and wire this through. The trauma won't let that happen. But you're kind of teaching the cerebellum, maybe, this is my speculation, to go, I see a pattern, or maybe this is actually more like the basal ganglia areas, because they're more responsible for observing this, and then the cerebellum encodes it. So maybe one of these areas goes, chaps, I see a possibility here where we can look. There's a shortcut. We should activate that, and then that kind of teaches the cerebellum to go, okay, I'll activate that, and it codes it, and boom, next time you come to that event, and this is what people with EMDR describe after EMDR. When you next come to that traumatic event, it just doesn't happen. You just end up remembering the better thing. You sort of slide right round it, like water going down, hitting a dam. If you create a channel around it, the water's just going to go, oh, okay, and it's going to go around the channel. And then down, a long time later, you're going to come along and be like, oh yeah, there was a dam there, but the river's now just moving right around it. It doesn't bother. And I'm speculating here that process, I used to conceptualize that as very neocortical, left brain, right brain up in the neocortex. And I'm really wondering whether it's like how much the basal ganglia and the cerebellum and, the norepinephrine is doing the triggering. Maybe that's the thing that's stopping it. So if you can find a path that isn't norepinephrine based, then your brain goes, hey, that's lower energy. Let's do that. And boom, you have a potential mechanism for explaining this. So EMDR could be the thing that goes around exactly what we're talking about. But it also might be the case, I think, like what you were saying a minute ago, before I started that long little story, given that we know this, we can be more targeted in our therapy and our support for people who are in the struggle. So EMDR might be one of them, but there might be other things that are a really base level. Like my sister's always banging on about the Palavis, like this physical crossing the body practice, like very basic body movements that has a remarkable impact on your cognition. So it's really ground up. You're not trying to solve it by working through the trauma, thinking through the trauma, and like your narrative, your awareness, but you're solving it by going, hey, I'm going to retrain my body. I'm going to do a Roger Federer on myself and just learn how to play tennis in a better way by practicing that. And then that works. It just stops you triggering the trauma, potentially. I don't know. That was a whole dump of stuff because I find that really compelling. I wonder what there is.
Didn't know that about that too.
It's one story for explaining how EMDR works. I'm not sure it's like proven, but it's a conceptualization to make sense of it.
So one thing that the article that we were talking about also says is that the norepinephrine is also required to recall the memory. So it's not only used for storing the traumatic event in the cerebellum, but also if they obstruct this connection and the norepinephrine can't reach the cerebellum, then they also don't even have the response to the cue. So they can't like retrieve it. So maybe like you were just saying, like if you are training the brain to pass this dam or whatever, then you're also kind of training to not even produce the hormones required to retrieve some kind of response. Like would you also be like lower the amount of
Interesting. So I wonder,
hormones that are produced over time?
so it begs the question, what's triggering the norepinephrine release? So potentially, in that little description, the trauma patch, quote unquote, could be an activation that has a hook in it that triggers norepinephrine. And by working around it, you're trying to create a pathway that just hasn't got a norepinephrine trigger. I mean, this is complete speculation, but it sounds kind of plausible. Like that could be what's happening. I mean, it's a mechanism. It's probably an oversimplified mechanism. But if you can then basically go, hey, if I trigger norepinephrine, I wonder if you could just test that. If you could, like, you get those patches for blood sugar. If you can get a patch that through your day tells you what your dopamine and norepinephrine levels are. So you'd be like, oh, it turns out that every time I talk to that person, I get a big norepinephrine spike. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, that's probably a toxic relationship. Like maybe not their fault, maybe their fault. I don't know, but whatever. Somehow I need to pay attention to this.
I would love this measurement.
But can you imagine if that's like tied to your Apple Watch and then your Apple Watch buzzes and goes, good morning.
Uncomfortable person detected.
But like,
remove yourself from this interaction.
Do you know, because at some level, right, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about like a functioning brain should do that automatically and naturally because that's what that stuff's there for. So we're talking about the situations where that stuff isn't working smoothly, shall we say. It's working in a slightly dysregulated way, either too much or too little, or not firing at the right times. So actually creating a loop with some kind of external support mechanism that helps you do that. I don't know whether that's like, like a wheelchair ramp, because if you're in a wheelchair, that's an external example of support right there. But it doesn't matter how many times you go up a wheelchair ramp, you never get better at going upstairs. There's like something fundamental that's challenging about stairs if you're a wheelchair user, right? Whereas there are other things where if you're like rehabilitating like a limp or something, where if you practice it, you can actually rehabilitate it to some percentage of what it was before. I would be curious whether some of the stuff that we're describing here is like, let's imagine that we did have like an AI watch that sat on your wrist that could tell us, is that like a wheelchair ramp that the user would then have to depend on for the rest of their life because this stuff doesn't actually heal like intrinsically? Or is it a bit more like rehabilitation there? If you support it, actually the brain starts learning it and you can sort of damp down the amount that you get from the watch and then start taking over. I think this is a really big question because in therapy, it's like, are you infantilizing people by being a support for them? Are you taking away their agency? Or are you helping them do something that they just literally cannot do by themselves? And I think maybe different parts of this would be different, but that's the sort of question that I'm like, we don't know. They have different shapes. I'm very curious about that. I'm not sure I have an answer or a point here beyond going, oh, interesting. I think we should
That's also something that I was wondering about because we have, like, as far as I know, we don't really have ways to, like, consciously, how do I say this? Like, to automatically release more hormones. I mean, that's why medications exist that force your brain to do this. So we have medications that, for example, make your brain release dopamine or norepinephrine, such as the ADHD medications. I don't know about the existence of medications that make these amounts lower, but I'm not sure if they exist. So, like, if you have both, then you would be able to regulate it really well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time with these things, you have kind of two angles on them. There's the production and there's the uptake, right? So, or its presence in your system doesn't do anything by itself usually. Usually
No,
it's the
true.
production of it that happens in some kind of process. And that production can actually be a byproduct of something else that's happening for a different reason, or it can be intentional to create that. And then you've got the uptake, where it binds to something, and in the process of binding something causes
Yeah.
a cascade effect.
But now we're able to either produce it or stop the reuptake. But are we able to force the uptake?
Depends what's stopping the uptake. If there's not enough receptors, that's going to be a hard one. Because, I mean, one of the absolutely fascinating things that I found out some years ago is that when you're born as a baby, you actually don't have, your body hasn't set equilibrium points for a lot of your hormones yet. So things like cortisol, like a baby's body has no opinion about what the normal level of cortisol is. And a lot of this happens in age 2. Now, I know this about cortisol specifically. So somewhere during people's second year on this planet, there's like in the space of a month, the baby's body will basically look at the amount of cortisol kicking around right now and say that's normal, and encode that amount by creating, by balancing the generators and the uptake sites of it, so that it can maintain that level. So if you've got an extremely stressful childhood at that age, and I don't know why I might know about this, then your body basically learns that a very high level of cortisol is completely normal. And at that point, you live life with a high cortisol load. And even if it looks a normal cortisol load because your body's creating a normal amount, you might not have enough uptake receptors, so it just sort of floats around for a longer time rather than being reabsorbed or reuptaked. And if you've got something like that, you get side effects. So if you've got cortisol floating around in your system all the time and at the wrong times of day and stuff like that, your joints start getting super wobbly, and you get things, I mean, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, strong correlation with ADHD, hyperflexibility. Like, I'm hypermobile, not quite to the medical, like not quite to Ehlers-Danlos. Danlos? I've read it, and I'm now like, I don't think I've ever said that name, so I don't know how to pronounce it. But there's this condition basically where you're hyperflexible, and that's correlated strongly with ADHD. And you get all these multiple, a lot of the time we get these multiple comorbid symptoms, right? You'll have some physical stuff, you'll have some psychiatric stuff, you have like mental health stuff. If you've got a hormone that's floating around that has lots of impacts in various places and is out of whack, it's going to impact all those systems. So you might end up having joint issues and struggles psychologically because brain and joints are affected. I know that happens with cortisol. I wonder what the consequence of norepinephrine just kicking around in your system for your life is, and whether there's a point in life, maybe age 2, where your body goes, this is the normal amount, I'm going to lock it in. And then you're just there, which, I mean, unfortunately, the pressure that this puts on young parents and mothers in particular to like get it right is crazy high, because we're basically saying you got
That could even be the point where it is decided whether you're going to be autistic or ADHD.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strong correlation with perinatal trauma and ADHD. So in the womb, birth, and just after.
Yeah. So if it's linked to kind of a base level of norepinephrine that's determined in some point of your very early childhood.
And other hormones, yeah, like the whole
Yes, for
cocktail,
sure.
right? But
Simplified, but
yeah. So those early years matter so much, which is kind of depressing as an adult coming at this going, okay, because then you, going back to your question, can you fix, change, influence that bridge between the norepinephrine creation site and the cerebellum, either to, can we put a spigot on the tap so that we can, turn it up or turn it down? I mean, that's very psychiatric, right? That's what they try and do with drugs, isn't it? Or do you just manage it? I've been curious about neuroscience is that I think we do often get to this point where we're like, oh, fascinating. We pull the thread.
and then we don't have answers.
And then we make up some stories that kind of make sense of it, like interpretations of the data that allow us to reason about it as language and people, right? Because you can't reason about the science directly on a day-to-day basis. That's just too much data, too much information. You've got to create stories and simplify it. But there comes a point where we're like, oh, okay, cool. So that and lots of things we don't know and hypotheses. And then there's this sort of jump to like the therapeutic angle where you're then like, okay, how do we actively help people? And we can be inspired by that information, but we actually need to work with the absence of knowledge massively. And then psychotherapy has its own models for doing this that's sometimes very independent of the neuroscience, you know, based on lived behavior. It's kind of bridging those two. I think the more information we have from the brain, the more helpful that gets, but we still have to live it. And there comes a point in this neuroscience conversation where we often just stop and go, okay, well, great. We've invented a smartwatch that watches this stuff and gives you a beep. Cool. We might have
And
that
impossible.
in 2035. I don't know. It might actually be possible. I think it might be possible.
Yeah.
Let's get a grant and investigate it.
That would
For
be
real,
really
I
cool.
think that would be so awesome. I think people would 100% buy that. Like, wouldn't you? If you could be like, hold on, are you telling me that I can get a signal telling me on my phone or on my watch when I'm becoming dysregulated and haven't noticed it? I'd for sure want that. I'd be desperate for it. Okay, and that's my next startup idea right there. Don't start up startups unless you really have nothing else that you can do in your life and you're like, yeah, I just have to do this. I make a shit employee. I'm so bad as an employee. What are we interested in next then? What's up in our next?
Do you have any ideas?
What about that CRRV cluster? Because we've just spoken about how multiple things can work together and you get multiple expressions. So because I've only come across this on TikTok, right? So there's a part of me that's like, oh, interesting. Also potentially completely not credible, right? This could just be TikTok noise with people going, oh, I'm inventing a theory. And there's nothing behind it except some really bad interpretation of
Right.
some.
I haven't really read into it. I did Google Scholar it, and there are multiple articles on it.
Great. So we have an opportunity to go and do a dive on this and be like, do we think it's
Yes.
credible and how does it weave in? How all this stuff links together, maybe. And maybe
Already to
why
the big questions.
labels like ADHD and autism and dyspraxia and dyslexia may not actually serve us well as as causal labels. They may capture some of the expressed behavior and the phenomenon, but possibly not helpful in understanding why they're there, because it might not be a single cause. It might be quite a complex web. So I'm very excited by that.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening to our podcast today. If you like what we're talking about and want to hear more, do like, follow, and subscribe. It makes a really big difference. You can also find us on social media and our Patreon, Al and Meryl, or our website, alandmeryl.com. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.